Oh, good morning, everyone. Obviously, many of you in the room day to day deal with this issue. So what I wanted to talk about was a little bit about what we're starting to see as the changes. If we go back a few years, the headlines would have been full of things like websites being defaced. Now we see a lot on data breaches and data being stolen. But we also see that the attackers move on. They have different goals, and they have different methods, and they have different approaches. And of course, the legacy attacks continue every day, but hopefully by using the right organizational approaches and the right technology, those we can be largely successful in dealing with. However, as this war of evolution continues, the new attacks will require different organizational methods and different technologies to deal with them. So what does this sort of new world that we're in actually look like? Well, there's some key new principles, I think, which underpin how one needs to think about it. The first one is the original idea that you could stop these things getting in, I think is pretty much dead now. You should be assuming that there are already things inside your network, and the question is, what are they, and is what they're doing really a problem? I think if you sit there and you believe that you're not going to have stuff already in your network, then you're almost certainly wrong, but it also will lead you to a set of management and organization decisions which are actually very, very dangerous. The next point is one that was just mentioned, which is if someone really wants to, and they're sophisticated enough, it is not possible to keep them out. That is a battle which has been lost. What is possible, though, is to restrict what they're actually able to do without breaking cover to the point that you can actually deal with them. So again, a little bit different in how we're thinking. And obviously here, I'm talking about some of the more sophisticated attacks and attackers that we see out there. The biggest issue which people have really ducked is the insider issue. Every day, most of you have organizations that will allow tens of thousands of people access. Some of those people may be malevolent, but many of them may just do pretty silly things which give an attacker the ability to get in. The important thing about these first three is we're almost at the point now where sometimes it's almost impossible to tell how something got in. And one of the things that people used to be very obsessed about was attribution. Who is it that's doing this, and how did they get in? Well, actually, the sophistication of what's going on now means that attribution is almost a pointless task. It's so possible to look like someone else. And also, most of the time, for the very sophisticated things, you don't know how they did it. And so what you have to do is assume that they can get in there. And then we see technology changes. A lot of the previous generation of approaches we saw technically were based on signatures. So, we'd seen some aspect of this malware before, and we had technology that would spot that typically at the boundary. Well, it's certainly been a while where sophisticated attackers have been able to produce signature-free attacks, but now the kits to do that are available to mid-level attackers, and so systems that are completely based on signatures will just not work anymore. Now, that's not to say that if you're using those methods, you shouldn't keep using them. That's obviously a good thing, and it will deal with a large volume of stuff that's coming in, but you can no longer rely on it. I think once you take those principles on board, then you start thinking in a different way. The first one is the boundary. Most of the first generation of technology approach has been around the boundary, endpoint protection, firewalls, etc., etc., etc. These things are good. They're good to have, but they're rather like your skin. You certainly want them, but if you're relying on them, you're not going to last very long. It's very easy to get past the boundary now. And the more connected that companies come with, for example, supply chain connections, which are often some of the attack points, and the insider issue, mean that the boundary is probably not the place to be relying on for dealing with the really sophisticated attacks. Another way of looking at it is that an attacker, for the sophisticated attacks, crosses the boundary once. You get one shot at finding what they're up to and seeing them at the boundary. If they come inside and actually start doing something, you actually have multiple possibilities of getting them. On the signature and malware front, this is a big change. We're going to see even less sophisticated attackers using signature-free attacks, and again, that means that we need to rethink. And the real test of this is if you go into an organization at the moment, which is, so in the case of FTSE 100, it's doing most things right, it's got the boundary set up, it's got all of the usual things, then they will be defending against the vast, vast majority of attacks. But the current statistics are that when you go in and you actually look inside, you will find 80% of the time there's something really quite nasty that's sitting in there. So we need the current approaches that we've been using to deal with the volume, but actually for the next generation of attack as it's evolving, we have to assume that people have already made it in. So what do these new kind of attacks look like? Well, you can sort of classify them into sort of three interesting camps. The first one is what we call silent but deadly. So very analogous to the crocodile. It just gets in, crosses the boundary, very small number of times, perhaps once, and then it sits there and it does very little most of the time. And the attack is a much more sophisticated one. So an example of this would be some code that we saw in a financial institution. We don't know how it got in, and it was active for about 50 milliseconds a week. But during those 50 milliseconds a week, what it was doing was making minor changes to ledgers. And we assumed that the goal here was that this thing would sit there very quietly doing this, and then after a long period of time, the ledgers would have been rolled into the backups and the reconciliations, and if the code had made a list of the changes it made, which it then would have given out, someone would have been able to point out that the balances in the financial institution were wrong. And the important thing about that is that's a trust attack. As soon as that becomes public, the counterparties for that institution, and it's a pretty existential kind of point if you can no longer trust the balances. But the thing that's fascinating about this attack is how quiet it was. Its whole idea was to just stay there as long as it needed to, keep doing this. Very different to what we see. And these silent but deadly type trust attacks, we're seeing a lot more of those, and they are quite difficult because the activity level is so small. So they're unsignatured and they're not doing a lot. So you have to look out for them with a lot of surveillance in what's going on in the network. The next category is something we're seeing a lot of in the newspapers at the moment, which is exactly the opposite. This is something that once it's got in, at some point suddenly goes manic and starts doing things very rapidly. And the one that we're all seeing at the moment is ransomware. So again, it can get in very quietly. We do see them sometimes sit there quietly until they're told what to do. And then their goal is to encrypt data as fast as possible, faster than you can possibly react, so that by the time you're dealing with the problem, a sufficient amount of the data has been encrypted and the problem. You can also run it a bit like the silent one, where the encryption goes slowly enough that it starts to get into the backups. But the biggest issue there is the very fast. That's very much an attack that's very fashionable at the moment. And then you have the sort of combination of the two, which is the kill switch model. So we've seen a couple of these that have been very large and very public. So basically, again, code gets in, often people are not quite sure how it got in, and the code sits there very quietly until a point where it then changes mode, and basically its goal is to disable operations, whether that be the network or it be industrial control systems. So it switches from being a sleeper to being incredibly active. If you don't catch it at the boundary, which is obviously a one-shot attempt, then what tends to happen is that we do see them sometimes ping home just to say, I'm still in control if you need me. But obviously, you would expect that very sophisticated users would actually take that on trust and keep the thing completely silent. So that's some examples of the new things that are going on. The important thing is that you won't get them by signature, so it's a question of what they're doing. So if we move back from the boundary and we say, well, however it got in, we've got to look at what's going on, then what you've got is a sort of model which is about thinking about the system and the organization, the people, the technology, the network, all of that together. And the first idea might be one that we've seen for a while, which is the idea of rules. So, we sit there and we try and think about all the attacks we know about, and what we want is something to tell us that something's going on. So a simple example of a rule might be, if there's a connection to Kazakhstan, set off an alarm, or if a 2 gigabyte file moves, set off an alarm, and this sort of thing. And although that sounds very appealing, in that we feel we could somehow sit down and write all these rules, in a modern company it doesn't work. And the reason is that unbeknown to you, suddenly there is a sales opportunity in Kazakhstan and someone's sending stuff to Kazakhstan, or the guy in video does send a 2 gigabyte file. And so what tends to happen is a vast amount of maintenance in trying to write and maintain these rules, but also the burglar alarms going off all the time. And the one thing that the attackers know is if you see a house with a burglar alarm and you want to break in, the way you do that is you turn up on random nights for the previous 2 months at 3 o'clock in the morning and you set the burglar alarm off. And then eventually no one takes any notice of the burglar alarm. And so the difficulty in this approach is that actually the alarm rate is so high because modern businesses are so dynamic that actually an attacker will just start to trigger the alarms to the point where you won't actually deal with them. So what are the kind of approaches that are being developed for dealing with these kind of new threats? Well, a very good analogy for the model is the biological immune system. So we all have boundary protection, we have skin, but actually we have insiders. We all have bacteria and viruses, and because we shake hands with people and interact, we're continually allowing our boundary to be invaded. But what we have is a rather wonderful thing, which is an immune system. When we're in the womb, that learns what is self. It learns all about us, all the different bits of us. And then when something appears that is not self, even if it's not been seen before, the system, by its actions, can decide that it's something that it wants to deal with and it wants to alert us to. And that is the biological immune system, and it's been fighting a very similar war about control of resources and information since the beginning of life. So the question comes, in a modern complex company that's continually changing with devices being added and people being hired and fired and all this sort of thing, how can you actually make that work in practice? And one of the interesting areas that we're starting to see a large number of companies start to try and use is the new machine learning technologies. So you'll be familiar with these in areas like computer vision and speech and Siri, and there's always, almost weekly now, we seem to read of an artificial intelligence beating some human at a game or driving cars or whatever. The way that these systems work is that they get connected onto the network, they watch all the transactions, and then they learn what's going on. And they learn everything that's going by. So in effect, they're learning all the topology, the devices, the end user devices, the users, and they build up this pattern of self, and then they can see things that are doing actions that don't look right. And there is a learning process here. In practice, it takes about a week. And during that time, it will do things that don't look right, but are actually innocent. So during that time, it comes to you and said, I've seen this strange activity over here, and it turns out that's actually your own security department checking stuff, and the machine can learn and deal with that. So how does this actually look in practice, this new world? Well, you still very much have to rely on the boundary and methods that you've been using up to now. But to deal with the 80% situation where stuff is already in, then what you do is, these are automatic systems. They get plugged onto a passive tap. You leave them alone, you don't set up any rules, and then a week later they start telling you about things they don't like. You tell them which of those are innocent, a lot of them aren't, and you go and deal with them. And then at that point, the system has a very good understanding which it continues to adapt. And these things can also work with virtual machines and in the cloud and that sort of thing. So that's talking about technology. What about people? Well, the reality of this evolving threat and the fact that actually the cyber threat is very much just the price of being in the wonderful digital world and all the benefits of that mean that the complexity of the task for the people is going up. And there's a massive shortage of people that actually have the skill set now to deal with this area. And so what you have to see is a partnership between the organizational methods, people, and technology. So a very simple example of this is if the technology can classify threats so that the human analyst doesn't have to go away and do that, and then the analyst can take it to the next level, that's very important because we are not going to have enough analysts. So we have to actually use them more effectively. And so you're going to see an interplay there of people and technology. Obviously, all the methods of trying to train your staff not to do crazy things are very important, but again, that's not going to be sufficient on its own. The next area is one that we were just talking about, which is this is not an IT issue. This is a main board issue. It is the price that you pay for being in the modern, wonderful world and all of the opportunities that you have from that. And so it has to be dealt with as a major part of the corporate risk register. The board have to be completely bought into it, and it cannot be delegated to IT because of the interactions that are going on there. And similarly, coming back to the assumption is you are already infiltrated. The question is whether that infiltration becomes a problem. To use the biological analogy, you have viruses in your nose, are they causing you a problem? But what it does mean is that you have to be absolutely prepared that someone's going to walk in tomorrow and say, we've got something really nasty going on. And boards still not quite there. They still would like to think that if they put a lock on every door and window, it just cannot happen. The planning should be, it is definitely happening, and this is my pack for handling the PR, the messaging, and what we do for dealing with this going forward. So people obviously crucial to the solution, but there are some areas now where we're seeing the evolving threat mean that it's very difficult for them to handle it. And one of those is speed. So if we talk about those ransomware type attacks, when they kick off, if you say that there's a mean time to get a human response of 20 minutes, if that machine that has been infiltrated there or group of machines is sufficiently powerful, in 20 minutes a very large amount of damage can be done. And so what you've again got to do is see a partnership, and what we have now is technologies coming that we're starting to see the first from various providers, which are technologies which actually actively take action. So they detect that the attack has kicked off, and their goal is to buy 20 minutes, enough to get you out of bed to decide what you're going to do. So for example, they will do things like slow down the connection ability of the machines that are involved by a factor of 100. You can't do it. You can't just shut them off because they may be running processes that are actually important to the company. But what you can do is slow the attack down enough that you and your team can respond. And the reason this is important is that last year we saw a truly amazing thing. We saw the first machine intelligence-based attack. It was rather beautiful, and we were very lucky to see it, because what it did was it got in, again, no one knows how it got in, and it spent a period looking around at the network and learning how to blend in. So it had its goal of what it was doing, but it was very actively learning how to fit in, how to camouflage itself. And so we are likely to be entering a period where, for the very sophisticated attackers, we're going to see a very interesting point in human history, actually, where we see machine versus machine. And both of those are relatively autonomously making decisions about what goes on. One other area that's been overlooked a lot because it's quite difficult is industrial control systems and SCADA. We seem to have something going on with the lights here, for example. The reason these are difficult is that the systems were all generally put there long before people were thinking about the internet. So they're often, you've got bits of plant that have been retrofitted with IP. They all have bizarre, unique protocols controlling them. And yet they are an incredible vulnerability. The ability to go into a manufacturer and basically screw up the production line, or telco and screw up the routing network, is real direct day one damage. And the nice thing about the immune system approach is because they learn self, they're not put off by the fact that actually this Czechoslovakian rolling mill that was actually built in the 70s and has been retrofitted has its own protocol, because it will learn the action of that. And we see this also in strange protocols around other devices. So for example, we saw a very nasty thing last week, which was an Italian major company, and the video conferencing system was a rather bizarre beast. And it was a beautiful attack, very, very quiet, but basically recording everything said in the room. And because it was non-standard, it would be very hard to write a rule for that, but suddenly that machine was behaving in a way that it shouldn't. Obviously, this is crucial if you're in any area where you have a nation-state likelihood of attack, so things like water, power, and transport. And it should be noted that the connection between the corporate network and the ICS world is becoming very blurred. People like to think that they're separate, but they're not. And of course, that means that there's connections between which can be exploited. So this stuff is now real. So you see people actually very much still using the first generation of approaches and the boundary and those sort of methods, and obviously the correct practices, but actually implementing the immune system type approaches across many, many different industries. Some of the things you find are very worrying about the power that they have and how quiet they were in doing it. Others are frankly quite amusing. Italian bank, every night its servers were being taken over by someone to mine for Bitcoin, which is a rather wonderful thing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you'll see a rail network overseas, which is basically totally under the control of a different nation. Or the major law firm doing a case involving very high profile national of a country, doesn't get on with the leadership of that country. And they would, the defense in this, and the documents were arranged in the case, again, beautifully done, so that if anyone read one of the documents, it started a process which led to all their other documents being sent to the other side. Now, that's really bad if you're the defendant, but that kind of attack becoming public would undermine all the confidence your clients had in the law firm. So it doesn't really matter what area you're in, because you can be tangential to goals, you may well be seeing some of these very sophisticated attacks. So you've got a wonderful set of speakers over the day that will cover many of the different aspects that we've been talking about. I think my message is this is continually evolving. Some of the solutions will be changes in the technology, some of them will be changes in the approach. Headlines, insider threat is massively underestimated still. The industry doesn't like to talk about it because it doesn't really have good solutions, but it is the key threat, whether that be malevolent or just idiocy in what's going on. Your model should be that you are already infiltrated, and then it's a question of whether that infiltration is a problem. You should assume that the kind of attacks you've got are changing and evolving, and there's a spectrum from very sophisticated existential ones to very high volume difficult ones, and you have to deal with all of those. And then think about the different attack modes, the sleeper, the very, very rapid, and the ones which actually flip between the two, and how would you deal with them? So for example, your response as a human to a very rapid attack, what are you going to let the technology do to buy you time, and then how are you going to make sure that you can react to that quickly enough. And then thinking about the idea of being inside and dealing with what's going on. So, and then start to think about the sophistication going up. This is not a snapshot situation. The evolution on both sides of the defense and the attack will continue, and that means that the methods and the technologies being used and the social engineering being used will also continue. And it's a good idea to be thinking a little bit ahead about what that means for your organization. So I hope I've given you some things to think about for the day, and that you'll enjoy hearing the rest of the speakers and how all of these things fit into what is an incredibly interesting, if somewhat challenging, evolving threat that we see going forward. Thank you very much.